For 8 years, Beatrice has marked the anniversary of her husband and son's disappearance the same way, by walking the shores of Chatham, Massachusetts, staring out at the unforgiving Atlantic that swallowed them whole. The official report called it a tragic accident, a sudden squall capsizing their small fishing boat. But a week after the 8th anniversary, a powerful nor'easter batters the coast, and when the winds die down, a local discovers a rusted trawler, not seen before, wedged high on a secluded beach, its hull crudely painted with the words P.O.N. Coast Guard. This story is a difficult one, and it makes you wonder about the secrets the ocean keeps. If you've ever felt that pull of a mystery that just won't let you go, stick with us as we uncover what really happened out on those waves. The silence of the house was the heaviest thing Beatrice owned. It had been 8 years since the sound of her son Cormac's laughter echoed off the kitchen walls. 8 years since her husband Alistair's heavy footsteps signaled his return from the docks. Now, the only sound was the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, counting out the seconds of her solitude. She stood in the living room, her fingers tracing the frame of a photograph on the mantelpiece. It was the last one she ever took. Alistair, his arm slung proudly around a 14-year-old Cormac, both of them grinning as they held up a massive striped bass. Their faces were tanned from a summer on the water, their eyes bright with a life that Beatrice could now only visit in memories. She had learned to live with the ghosts. She had accepted the official story because accepting it was the only way to survive. A freak squall, the Coast Guard had said. Unpredictable, tragic, but simple. An act of nature. But in the deepest, quietest parts of her heart, a small, stubborn part of her had always rejected the simplicity. Alistair was too good a sailor. He respected the ocean too much to be caught off guard. The phone rang, its shrill noise tearing through the quiet sanctuary of her home. She flinched. It was probably one of the ladies from her book club checking in. She almost let it go to voicemail, but on the 4th ring, she picked it up. "Hello," she said, her voice a little rough from disuse. "Is this Mrs. Beatrice DeRosa?" a young, nervous voice asked. "Yes, this is she." "Ma'am, this is Officer Riley from the Chatham Police Department." Beatrice's blood went cold. The police hadn't called her in years. A boat washed up on North Beach Island. During the storm. It's unusual. We think you should see it. Hope was a poison she had sworn off years ago. It burned, it corroded, and it left you emptier than before. But as the officer spoke, she felt its familiar, terrible sting in her chest. A boat. "I'll be right there," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. At the small police station, she was met by Detective Kalin, a man whose tired eyes told her he'd seen too many of the town's tragedies. He had inherited Alistair and Cormac's cold case file when the previous detective retired. He led her to his cluttered office without much preamble. He gestured to his computer monitor. "The harbor master sent this over an hour ago." On the screen was a photograph of a boat. It wasn't a pleasure craft like Alistair's. This was a hulking, rusted fishing trawler, listing awkwardly on a stretch of sand, seaweed clinging to its sides like ancient funeral robes. But it was the crude, hand-painted white letters on the hull that made her lean closer, her breath catching in her throat. P.O.N. Coast Guard. "It's not an official vessel," Detective Kalin said, his voice low. "The lettering is all wrong. The font, the spacing, the hull number's been filed off. It's a ghost boat. But the thing is, Beatrice, It washed up now, a week after the anniversary. Beatrice stared at the image, her mind racing, connecting dots that had been scattered for years. A ghost boat, a fake Coast Guard vessel. "An accident doesn't file off a hull number," she said, her voice hard as stone. She turned to look at the detective, and the grief that had softened her features for 8 years was replaced by a fierce, unyielding resolve. "You have to reopen the case. Properly this time." Detective Kalin was hesitant. He explained the budget constraints, the lack of new leads, the sheer impossibility of investigating a boat that had likely been drifting for years. It was a long shot, a 1 in a million chance that this rusted piece of junk had anything to do with a case that was officially closed. But he didn't know the Beatrice who had been forged in 8 years of silent grief. She was not the weeping widow he had read about in the old files. She was a woman with nothing left to lose, and one question that needed an answer. She insisted, her voice never rising but filled with an intensity that made it clear this was not a request. She would not be dismissed. She would not be pacified. Finally, seeing the fire in her eyes, Kalin relented. "Okay, Beatrice, we'll look into it. But I want you to manage your expectations." "I have no expectations," she replied honestly. "Only questions." Her first demand was to see the boat herself. The next morning, they took a police launch across the choppy water to North Beach Island, a barrier island that protected the coast. The air was thick with the smell of salt and decay. As they rounded a spit of sand, the trawler came into view. It was bigger up close, more menacing. It looked like a predator that had crawled onto the shore to die. Beatrice stepped off the launch onto the wet sand and walked toward it, her boots sinking into the muck. She reached out and ran a hand over the rough, peeling paint of the fake lettering. "P-O-N," she whispered. "What does that mean?" Kalin had no answer. The forensics team spent the day on the boat, but it was a frustrating task. Years in the salt water had scoured it clean of any useful evidence. The cabin was a wreck of rusted metal and rotted wood. It was a dead end, and she could see the "I told you so" look in Kalin's eyes, even if he was kind enough not to say it. But, as one of the technicians was doing a final sweep of the cramped engine compartment, he found something. Tucked away behind a corroded manifold, there was a small metal plate, one that the person who filed off the main hull number had missed. It was almost unreadable, covered in layers of grease and rust. Back at the lab, they worked on it for hours. Using a mild acid and digital imaging software, they managed to enhance the faint indentations. It wasn't a full number, but it was a partial, and it was enough. The number belonged to a vessel registered out of Nantucket, a trawler that had been reported as scrapped over a decade ago. The registered owner was a man named Silas Croft. The name meant nothing to Beatrice, but it was the first new piece of information in 2,928 days. Detective Kalin found an address. Silas Croft was still in Nantucket. "I'm coming with you," Beatrice said. Kalin started to object, citing police procedure, but one look at her face, and he knew it was pointless to argue. The ferry ride to Nantucket was a silent, tense journey. For most people, it was a scenic trip to a beautiful island. For Beatrice, it was a voyage into the past, every wave a reminder of the water that held her family. She stared at the churning gray sea, not as a source of life and safe and beauty, but as a vast, unmarked grave. They found Silas Croft in a run-down trailer park on the edge of town. The air smelled of stale beer and desperation. He was a man worn down by life, with suspicion etched into the lines on his face. When Kalin identified himself and asked about the old trawler, Croft was immediately hostile. "Never heard of it," he grunted, turning to go back inside his trailer. "That was my boat. Sold it for scrap years ago. Don't know nothing about it now." Kalin began to press him, mentioning things like obstruction of justice and aiding a federal investigation. But Croft just sneered, a man who had heard threats from cops before. Beatrice stepped forward, her heart pounding. She pulled the worn photograph of Alistair and Cormac from her wallet, the one from the mantelpiece. She held it out to him. Her hand was shaking. "This was my husband, Alistair, and this was my boy, Cormac," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "They went fishing 8 years ago, and they never came home. The boat you sold is the first new thing we have found in all that time. If you know anything at all, please." She wasn't a cop making a threat. She was a mother and a wife, appealing to whatever shred of humanity was left in him. Silas Croft stared at the smiling faces in the photograph. He looked at Beatrice's desperate eyes. Something inside him seemed to break. He let out a long, shuddering sigh and slumped against the doorframe. "It wasn't a scrap," he finally admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "I sold it 9, maybe 10 years ago. Off the books. Needed the cash." He described the men who had bought it. There were 2 of them. They weren't locals. They had the hard, impatient look of men who lived by their own rules. They paid in cash, a thick roll of bills, and didn't haggle. "They weren't fishermen," Silas said, shaking his head. "I can spot a real fisherman a mile away. These guys, they were something else." The story tumbled out of him, a confession years in the making. He knew it was shady, but he was in debt and didn't ask questions. He signed the title over and walked away. This was it, the twist. The moment the simple story of a boating accident became something dark and complex. Beatrice held her breath and asked the question that had been haunting her since she first saw the boat. "PON," she said. "The letters on the hull. What did they stand for?" Silas Croft let out a short, bitter laugh. "That was just my name for the old girl, a joke. She was such a piece of junk, I called her the Port of Nantucket. Figured she'd never make it much farther than that." He looked back at Beatrice, his eyes filled with a sudden, dawning horror as he realized the implication of his next words. That Coast Guard nonsense. That was them. I saw them starting to paint it on, right there on the dock, before they even handed me the last of the money. The words hung in the air, heavy and damning. A fake Coast Guard boat. The official story of a tragic accident didn't just have a hole in it anymore. It had been blown wide open. Alistair and Cormac hadn't been taken by a storm. They had been taken by something far more dangerous. Back in Chatham, the case transformed. It was no longer a cold file in a drawer. It was an active, multi-agency investigation. With the detailed descriptions Silas Croft had provided, police sketch artists created composites of the 2 men. Detective Kalin had the sketches distributed to every police department and Coast Guard station in New England. For days, there was nothing but silence. Beatrice waited, trapped in a new kind of limbo. The uncertainty of the past 8 years had been replaced by the terrifying certainty that her husband and son had met with foul play. The what if had become who. Then a call came. A retired police officer from Gloucester, Massachusetts, recognized one of the faces. The sketch matched a man who had been part of a small, nasty crew operating a decade earlier. They were suspected in a string of robberies on the water. Their method was always the same. They would approach pleasure boats, sometimes pretending to be officials, sometimes feigning distress. They would board the vessels, rob the occupants of cash, electronics, and fishing gear, and then disable their engines, leaving them stranded. The crew was suspected of escalating their violence, but then, around the same time Alistair and Cormac went missing, the robberies stopped. The crew had simply vanished. Suddenly, the police had names. The man the retired officer recognized was named Declan Ross. His known associate was a man named Frank Gallo. A quick search of records showed that Frank Gallo was currently serving a sentence in a New Hampshire state prison for an armed robbery committed 2 years after the disappearances. Declan Ross, however, was harder to find. He'd fallen off the grid. The police put out an alert, and after a tense 48 hours, they found him. He was working as a cook on a scallop boat based out of Portland, Maine. Beatrice spent those days at the police station, unable to be at home in the suffocating silence. She drank stale coffee and paced the linoleum floors of the hallway, a ghost haunting the living. Caelan had promised he would tell her everything, as soon as there was something to tell. She watched as officers moved with a new urgency, their hushed conversations and ringing phones marking the quickening pace of the investigation. Every time Caelan walked down the hall, her heart would leap into her throat, a frantic bird beating against her ribs. Finally, late one evening, he appeared. He looked exhausted. His shoulders slumped, but his eyes were resolute. He didn't speak in the hallway. He simply gestured for her to follow him into his office and gently closed the door behind them. The quiet in the small room was deafening. "We got them, Beatrice," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of his news. "Gallo, the one in prison, he talked. He wanted a deal." Beatrice sank into the hard plastic chair opposite his desk, gripping its arms until her knuckles turned white. She braced herself. "Tell me," she whispered. Caelan took a deep breath. He explained the whole sordid operation. How Declan and Frank had used the old Trawler, their fake Coast Guard boat, to prey on unsuspecting boaters. They saw it as easy money, a way to fund their lives without honest work. They would target smaller boats, families out for a day of fishing, people who wouldn't put up a fight. Alistair and Cormac were their last job, Caelan said, his gaze unwavering, his voice filled with a deep, human sorrow. "According to Gallo, your husband was an experienced sailor. The moment their trawler approached, Alistair knew something was wrong. The boat was sitting too low in the water. The wake was wrong. The markings weren't right. He knew it wasn't a real Coast Guard vessel. Declan and Frank had pulled alongside, ordering Alistair to prepare for a routine inspection. Alistair had refused. He told them he knew who they were and that he was calling the real Coast Guard on his radio. He refused to let them board his boat. That's when the confrontation happened, out on the open water, with no one to see or hear. Alistair fought back. Gallo said he fought like a lion, using a fishing gaff to keep them at bay. And Cormac, her brave, sweet boy, had tried to protect his father. He'd thrown a tackle box, anything he could get his hands on. In the chaos and the struggle, things got out of hand. The men panicked. They weren't just thieves anymore. They were in a fight for their lives against a man who would die to protect his son. They didn't leave them stranded, Beatrice, Caelan finished, his voice cracking slightly. He reached across the desk, his hand hovering over hers for a moment before he pulled it back. "They scuttled your family's boat. They tied them up and they forced them to go down with it." He gave her the location. The Atlantis Canyon, a deep submarine trench southeast of Nantucket. "It's over 6,000 feet deep there," he said softly. "They wanted to make sure there were no witnesses. They wanted to make sure there was no evidence left to find." The truth was not a comfort. It was a physical blow, a wave of ice and fire that stole the air from her lungs. An accident, a storm, the impersonal cruelty of nature. That was a tragedy she had learned to live with. This was different. This was the deliberate, brutal cruelty of men. Her husband and son hadn't been lost. They had been taken. They had been murdered. For 8 years, she had grieved the unknown. Now, she had to learn to grieve the known. A truth so horrific, it threatened to shatter the fragile peace she had built. There would be no body to bring home, no grave to visit. Just the cold, dark knowledge of their final moments, fighting together in a place deeper and darker than she could ever imagine. Months passed in a blur of legal proceedings. Declan Ross and Frank Gallo were tried and convicted, sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Beatrice attended every day of the trial, a stoic, silent presence in the front row. She listened to the grim details, forcing herself to bear witness to the story of her family's end. She never cried in the courtroom. Her tears were private, shed in the silence of her empty home. When it was all over, when justice, in its cold and impartial way, had been served, she knew what she had to do. She chartered a boat, a sturdy fishing vessel not unlike the one Alistair had so lovingly maintained. She hired a captain to take her out to the coordinates Kaelin had given her, out to the edge of the Atlantis Canyon. It was a calm, clear day in late summer. The sky a brilliant, cloudless blue. The sun warmed her face, and the sea was a gentle, rolling swell. It was a day made for fishing, a day Alistair and Cormac would have loved. When they reached the spot, the captain cut the engine. The sudden silence was profound, broken only by the cry of a distant gull and the soft lapping of water against the hull. Beatrice walked to the stern, carrying 2 wreaths of white roses. She was alone, just her and the vast blue emptiness of the ocean. She looked down at the water, so clear she could see the sunbeams penetrating deep into the blue. It was impossible to comprehend the crushing darkness 6,000 feet below. "Alistair," she said, her voice carried away by the breeze. "Cormac." She spoke to them for a long time. She told them about the trial, about the men who had been held accountable. She told them she knew they had fought, that they had been brave. She read a short poem Cormac had been forced to memorize for school, and had complained about endlessly, a poem about the sea that she had found tucked into one of his books. Finally, she let the wreaths go. They floated on the surface, 2 perfect circles of white on the endless blue. She watched them drift apart, carried by the currents, until they were just small specks in the distance. As she stood there, watching the wreaths disappear, a strange sense of peace settled over her. The crushing weight of 8 years of not knowing, of maybes and what-ifs, finally lifted. The grief was still there, a permanent part of her soul, but it no longer felt like a question mark. It had a shape, a story. It had an end. They weren't lost anymore. She knew where they were. They were together, in the deep quiet of the ocean they had both loved. And in a way, they were home. The journey back to shore was quiet. The sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. For the first time in 8 years, Beatrice looked at a sunset over the water and didn't feel the sting of loss. Instead, she felt a quiet sense of completion. The story was over. The truth was known. And now she could finally, truly begin to mourn. What do you think is harder to live with? The endless, gnawing uncertainty of not knowing what happened to a loved one, or the brutal, painful certainty of knowing they met a terrible end? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for joining us for this story. If you found yourself captivated by this journey for the truth, please consider liking this audio and subscribing for more stories that explore the depths of human resilience. We appreciate your time and your thoughtful attention.